What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to the Vault. This is Alex Garcia. I'm here with my friend Jesse Store, and today we're going to be talking about arm training and some of the cues that you guys can use to help you get the most out of your arm training, and also just we'll talk about the broader subject as well. So, Jesse, starting off today, we're talking about a really common, really quite common muscle group for people to train. I think that there's definitely I think it's important to have some emphasis on arm training because it can definitely benefit some of your main lifts. It can have, a lot of benefits aesthetically, obviously. Some people train simply for aesthetics, and that's one of the muscle groups you're going to see first. And then also in bodybuilding, that tends to be something that is also a point of emphasis is making sure you look big from the front, you got big arms. Tell us a little bit about your experience with training arms and like, what are some things that you've noticed?
Good question. Because before I know like my uh approach, well, I guess what your goals with training arms, I think, is what dictates how you train them. Because for me, it
Hmm.
was an area that I needed to improve, and I just was like, man, like I am not making the progress I'm making with my arms with other like other body groups.
Right.
And then I realized, okay, well, I don't have one day where I'm only training arms. I'm training buys on the days I train back, and that's only a couple sets at the end of the workout. And try
Right.
same thing maybe after I train chest or shoulders or something like that. At the end of the workout, I add a couple sets in. So it's like if you really want to be able to grow something, for one, hitting it when you're not fresh, and then only throwing it at the end of the workout, like it could be done or couldn't be done, then that's like the worst way to try to progress in something. So if you really want to like grow something, I ask people all the time when they say, well, because it's funny enough, like when I actually improve them, people are like, how do you train arms? What do you do for arms? I'm like, started training them
From
twice a
first.
week. Yeah, started
Yep.
training them twice a week, and I trained only arms on the days that I trained them. So it's just bis
Right.
and tries. That's all I trained, and I trained them hard, and I trained them just like everything else, and I did it 2 days a week. If I was
Heck
doing
yeah.
everything else once a week, so it's really that simple. When you start training, like the intensity has to be the same as everything else, and you have to really prioritize it as if you're prioritizing anything else. It can't just be at the end of the workout. I think those two
Right.
simple things you do right there will, for most people,
Hmm.
bridge the gap between trying to at least make some type of progress in the arms.
Well, I think that's interesting that you're just talking about, you're hitting your arms twice a week because that means that there's a specific split that you're going to try to hit to try to maintain that and actually see growth in your arms. So, I feel like one of the things that really helped me understand how to train basically any muscle group in the body is optimal frequency, just like you were saying, hitting them twice a week, you know, and there's obviously some level of, so I would argue that you can also take the approach of just training hitting them a little bit each day, and you
Yeah.
could see progress that way. But one of the things I think you bring up that's important to emphasize on top of what you were just talking about is like, the reason why you're doing those things is so that you can train them harder, so that you can actually see what you're capable of doing and where your ability currently stands, so that you can truly progress. Because a lot of times I think what you were just telling me about, putting them at the end of the workout, you're never really getting a good gauge of where your ability really lies with the certain movements, because they are secondary muscle groups, and they're going to be used a lot in your main lifts and things of that nature, like I said before. But you know I've still found, in the beginning, you can make a lot of great progress, not training arms too hard, still seeing a good amount. But I think that a lot of people are thinking, like, well, how do I get to that next step of really
So
seeing my arms,
yeah,
you
that's where
know?
I think that falls into place where it's like before, again, you first get in the gym, everything's gonna grow when you first
Yep.
start lifting. You just have that novice type of like sponge like,
Response.
where you
Newbie
just
gains, baby.
respond. Yeah, man, you respond very, very well. But then you get to a point, like you
Hmm.
said, where either you're, intermediate or you're advanced, and now you're like, well, shit, everything else is, growing and doing all these things because again, the intensity and the volume and the load and everything like that is probably
Hmm.
well balanced for those other areas. But arms usually or calves, same thing as like when you train legs and you don't train, calves either at the beginning of the workout or, as hard as you do everything else. And for me personally, so again, that comes to genetics as well, right? Like some people might like what I used to feel like, which is funny, is like oh, I don't hit arms as hard because my arms, I feel like they grow kind of easy. And then when I start hitting everything as hard as I
Sure.
was hitting it, the arm training had to come up as well. It just had to be able to
Yes.
balance the physique out. So you have to be
Right.
aware of those things too. Even when it comes to calves, calves are hard to grow as well. But if you're only throwing calves in, and even for me personally, with having like, genetically blessed, be able to have some pretty good calves, like I used to just throw it in, only like maybe one exercise a workout in terms of legs and just at the end of the workout, whatever. But then again, you find, well, shit, now now my calves are kind of falling behind a little bit. So the intensity
Yes.
there has to come up as well. So just having the right balance, I think, between the frequency, the volume, and the intensity is probably the
Mm-hmm.
biggest thing. Obviously, with training anything, but it's something that people
Mm.
overlook with arms a lot of times, or some of the smaller muscle groups, just because they don't feel like they
Yes.
really have to prioritize it.
So from a program design standpoint, where do you think that like what type of split do you think people can really utilize to help them grow their arms and see more progress that way?
It's different for everybody, but the way I usually
Mm-hmm.
do it, like again, like if you come to me and I say, what are your goals? And you say you want to gain some weight or gain some muscle. And I say, okay, what are your specific like physique goals? Okay, I want bigger
Mm-hmm.
arms. Then I'm gonna have you train arms twice a week and everything else only once a week because that's our priority.
Mm-hmm.
And most times people aren't, wanting to train more than 4 days a week, 5 days a week max. So it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
really make any sense anyway. So if I have them on a 4 day split, then I might go, okay, you're doing arms on day one, maybe chest and
Mm-hmm.
shoulders on day two, legs on day three, back on day
Mm-hmm.
four. And then if we do a day five, then you'll hit arms again. If we don't do 5 days, then um, we'll probably have to throw in like chest, shoulders, and back together or something like that, so that you're hitting
Yeah.
arms, chest, shoulders, and back together, and then legs on a day on its own, and then arms. But usually, I find when you're trying to grow arms, being able to give everything the same amount of volume it was getting before, essentially, at least like with a 5 day split, is usually the best way to do it with arms specifically,
Mm-hmm.
because again, like it's not like a lot of systemic fatigue is being built up. You're just
Mm-mm.
fatiguing and crushing the arms mainly. So you can hit 5 days and be fine in terms of recovery wise. But do
Right.
you agree with that? What do you find usually when it comes to programming for arms?
Yeah, I've that's basically what I would say. 2 days a week is really important. I think the goal matters indeed. One thing I will say is that like from a program standpoint, when I was training myself, one of the things that I did was I actually had an Arnold split where I did a 6 day, and that's like definitely for more advanced. But what I've seen is like when people talk about, oh, I want to grow my arms and make them look huge, like what do I have to do? One of the things that I've done is, prioritize, 2 arm days a week, still keeping the frequency of 2 leg days, because I still want to grow overall, like in my overall body, um, not just in my arms, but I'm still prioritizing arms by doing 2 arm days a week. So the way I split it up, I did chest and back, one, legs, and then arm day, and then I just repeat that over the course of 6 days basically. And I've seen really good results from that. I've been able to incorporate a couple of different personal movements that I like to use. Like I like to on my arm day, I actually love to throw shoulders in there too. Like
I
I'll
was
do a
going to ask you,
military
when do you train
press.
shoulders in? Because I didn't hear you mention
Yeah,
that.
I
So usually
actually will
shoulders
do
and arm
what
day.
I did at one point was actually I was military pressing twice a week because I really just I enjoy military pressing.
Really?
So
So do
yeah, and
you?
I
No, go ahead.
what were you gonna say? Yeah, I definitely still like to prioritize compound movements a lot. But I know that there's also some benefit to just starting off with a like 5 sets of tricep extensions or 4 sets or something like that to pre-exhaust if that's your goal to really train your arms specifically. Like
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's one thing too is like triceps are definitely going to take a considerable amount of effort, I would say. So I definitely like to put those earlier on because I know that that's going to contribute a lot to the size because that's like 2/3 of your arm right there. So I
Yeah.
don't mind doing a military press at the beginning because I'm going to engage triceps with that as well. And then
Mm-hmm.
I can just go into my next movement with triceps. And then if I can obviously take that same skeleton and if I decide okay biceps is my goal, then I'd do start off with something like a preacher curl, and that's where I'd probably say it's a little different. Like with biceps, I wouldn't start off with a back movement. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Because the with back, like, at like I wouldn't start off with like pull-ups or chin-ups or anything like that. I would just go straight into some preacher curls or a dumbbell curl, like I was saying before, so that you can really gauge where your ability truly lies. But again, like you were saying, goals matter. Goals really do matter because
Yeah.
that's how you're going to inform your programming, and that's where like if you're looking for specific results, then you have to specify that in your program for sure.
Yeah.
And I think the 6 day split is obviously like not a sustainable split. I wouldn't do it like for very long, but like, that's the thing too, is like if you really focus and you spend more time on those 2 days of, just hitting them harder than you've ever hit them before, like you'll be surprised how quickly you can see growth. As long as you're also doing, I would say the thing to remember too is like junk volume. Got it. Like there's a tendency for people to do arm stuff and do things like running the rack and basically just like negatives and pushing past failure and all that, and that's good stuff. Like it's fun to train that way, but it's also really important to prioritize recovery and making sure that you are recovering faster from these high intense more intense arm workouts than what you'd previously been hitting.
Yeah. And I think that's why I was gonna add something here. A couple of things is that for one, in terms of frequency, you might even be able to hit. I mean, there's some things you can hit even 3 times a week, but arms is like one of those
Mm-hmm.
things that if you really wanted to, you could go beginning, middle, and end of the week and hit arms 3 times, or like you said, at least throw a
Yeah.
little bit into each workout so that you don't have to
Right.
build in a day by themselves. Because
Right.
they do recover pretty quick. The only other thing I would just add in there, if you're gonna put the arms like what I do at the beginning of the week, is I usually follow that by a leg day, and then my next session after that, either I'll get my, and it just depends again how I recover. So if my arms are still
Mm-hmm.
sore the next day when I go to leg day, it probably doesn't make sense to train push like chest or shoulders because my triceps are going to get in the way, or back because my
Right.
biceps are going to get in the way. So I'll probably train legs. And then the next day, if my biceps and triceps are recovered, then technically I can go ahead and train chest and shoulders or back. If it's not, then maybe I'll take a day off and say, let me give myself one more day. And then I can
Yeah.
go in and chain chest, back, and then arms back to back to back 3 days in a row like that, because I know by that, by that last day, my arms are obviously going to be recovered and not be in too
Right.
bad a shape, especially for the second day. So just learning how to split it up, knowing that you can have some carryover in terms of soreness that can affect other days that you train as well. So knowing when to put in the arm days and how it can affect your other
Mm-hmm.
workouts matters as well.
Yeah.
But let's talk about some cues, like some specific lifting
Mm.
cues when it comes to training bis and tries. Um, any like weird, maybe some weird things, some little things that you picked up and learned that have allowed you to engage the biceps a little bit better,
Absolutely.
triceps a little bit better? What are some of those things?
Well, let's start off with biceps. So, one of the things that I have noticed with my biceps training is, they do a lot better when you don't necessarily, stand. I find it's better to have, like, you really try to isolate them. That, like, this is, if you're really thinking about arm training, like, this is one of those times, like, isolation's okay. So I would say like preacher curls are money. They are money because you're fully lengthening out that bicep. And basically at those lengths, at that this length down here, what I found is that actually as you squeeze, you start to lose tension towards the top. So there's like I feel like a lot of people put too much emphasis on this squeeze at the top when in reality where you really want is to get that lengthening effect at the bottom. So what I like to do is when I get on the preacher curl, I do a pause where I'm fully extended. I hold it there for about a second or two before I start the next rep. Another thing
Mhm.
too is like experimenting with different bars. I think the easy bar, you definitely want to be using the easy bar more often than not. Because I found that when I straight bar for more than a couple of weeks, I can feel it in my elbows at times, and so I'm big on using the easy bar. And with that, like that's basically the cue that I use for preacher curls is just that pause at the bottom. But another thing that's really important is that slow that eccentric. That eccentric is huge for muscle fiber recruitment. The research has supported seeing more muscle gains from eccentric focused movements rather than concentric focused movements. So this squeeze towards the top, it's all fine and dandy, but what I found is that lengthening phase, when you slow it down, you focus on you really focus in that moment of control, letting the weight control all the way into that pause, you're going to find that, you're not going to be able to move as much weight as you think. You'll
Mm.
have to have some more intention. But
Hmm.
those two cues have really forced me to look at myself and be like, you know what? I think I need to take the weight down. Another thing that I've learned too is, obviously easy bar preacher curl on the traditional preacher bench is great, but another thing you can do is, use the bench, use like a retractable bench and go single arm. And that cue right there can also be fun because what you can do there is you can get a little extra supination towards the top. So if you were wanting to add something to the top of the motion, I would add that supination and get a little bit of that bicep peak action. So those are some of the cues that I like to use. But what about you? What do you think
Yeah.
about those?
No, I agree. Those are definitely some good cues, and it's funny because I agree for the most part when it comes to the preacher curl and the most effective ranges of the range of motion. So like that bottom like
Mm-hmm.
lengthening portion of it, where maybe not getting it all the way to the top matters the most, but
Mm-hmm.
at least that bottom half really matters in terms of getting a full stretch. But then the opposite happens, and so usually when you train biceps, and for anybody who needs help with even programming, is you want to make sure you're adding in some type of bicep movement where the elbows are out in the to the front to the anterior, like a preacher curl.
Mm-hmm.
You want to add one where basically the elbows are basically, right by the shoulders essentially, so they're neutral.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you're really going to be the strongest. And then you want some where you have basically shoulder extension, so the elbow is behind the body, so a little bit to the
Mm-hmm.
posterior. And so if you do the ones like that, like a drag curl or something like that, like if you're doing dumbbell drag curls or easy bar drag curl, or even if you do like a
I like those
trilling,
cable
like
drag
cable,
curls.
exactly. So if you do like a cable drag curl, or even like stepping out a little bit where you're already creating some of that
Mm-hmm.
extension, and then you're curling from there. Again, the most important thing there being, usually when I see people do that, is the shoulder needs to stay extended. We don't want to come all the
Right.
way
It
forward
needs to
like this and curl.
maintain positioning as
The
you
only
go.
thing I want
Yep.
to do is bend at the elbow. That's where you really focus on that peak, and that's where getting that full contraction and as much like elbow flexion as you can matters the most, versus
Mm-hmm.
maybe doing a preacher
Mm-hmm.
curl where you might not feel it as much. So knowing the
Right.
exercise choices and how you should be executing certain exercise choices is very important as well for the specific cues you use with different exercises. Even with something as simple as a bicep curl, which most people would just say, all you got to do is just flex the elbow. There's still different ways to
Yeah.
execute the movement to get more out of it. So for biceps, at
Yeah.
least, I think knowing what exercises to choose and how to execute them is probably the biggest thing. But then the only other
Mm-hmm.
thing I would add even to that, which what you said with like the easy bar curl, at least even especially, is, and I saw Jared Feather talk about this the other day, and I hadn't thought about it this way because I always let my elbow. So there's one thing I also do as well, just to give a visual, is when you're curling up,
Mm-hmm.
you almost want that elbow to come forward a little bit. I don't want it to do this.
Mm-hmm.
My bicep doesn't
Right.
do anything there. It only needs to come forward just a little bit. But what you want to
Right.
do with that is I want to force my elbows in and keep my elbows in tight as I'm
Inward.
doing that as
Mm-hmm.
well. And that'll actually give you a
Mm-hmm.
little bit more bicep contraction too, which I found. So this was something I added even in just a few weeks ago. And I noticed, oh, like I actually, I kind of like how that feels. So just
Yes.
being aware, I think, of some of those smaller cues. They're not big movement changes that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the way you're actually thinking about engaging certain muscle fibers, and the position and placement of certain parts of your body as you're executing the movement.
Right. Well, that's interesting because, well, like, what do you think about like equipment selection? Like, what are some things that you feel like I know we just talked about the preacher curl. Like, what are some things that you feel like equipment wise are just money, like just money every time for biceps?
Man, honestly, I love cables for biceps only
Mm-hmm.
because you get constant tension usually throughout that range, not the same way that you would a dumbbell, just like a regular dumbbell curl. Now again, it depends on the position in there, because like if you do like that trailing cable curl that we talked about, where maybe you're seated and the cable's behind you, or you're standing and you're leaning out and the cable's behind you and maintaining that or that shoulder extension, excuse me, when you
Mm-hmm.
actually get a full range there, you're going to feel the tension the entire range of motion. It doesn't matter. You're going to feel it the entire range of motion. You do a dumbbell though, and you get to the top. At the top part, you're not going to feel as much there, right? That's just how free weights
Mm-hmm.
work. Your elbow is going to be supporting a little bit at the top, and so it's just not going to be the same. But what I would do is I wouldn't just pick one thing or the other. a lot of times I like to use a lot of different things, and that's the mindset you got to have when you're
Mm-hmm.
programming is, okay, I know the cable works in this way. I know it has my bicep working this specific way. I know the dumbbell has my bicep working a specific way. I know that I'm going to be able to move the most weight with two hands, like an easy bar curl or a straight bar curl, like you were talking about. So you want to add some stuff like that in, some other
Mm-hmm.
isolation stuff, like maybe a concentration curl. Again, playing with the angles, interior, right to the side, and then posterior a little bit with the elbows. So just playing with them and knowing, first of all, what feels really good for you, and then knowing how to actually implement that into a well-rounded program, which is harder
Yeah.
than it sounds. Obviously, it is a little bit harder than it sounds
Yeah.
because you have to understand the biomechanics. But
And you
that's
have
why when
yeah,
you
the
ask me a
technique.
question, yeah. So you asked me a question like that, saying like, are there any that just are money every time? There's exercises for me that work every time, but that don't mean it's gonna work for everybody. So what I would say is
Mm-hmm.
play around with different movements, play around with different ranges of motion, play around with different positionings, and see what works for you. Because at the end of the day, like that's really what it comes down to. Because I connect really, really well with like some rope cable curls or a bar cable curl, something like that. Somebody else, like I even have a client who they're just like, "Man, I just love dumbbell. I love free weight. Like that's what I feel
Yeah.
the most." All right,
Yeah.
well we'll do a little bit more free weight then. We'll still add in the other stuff because we need it, but
Yeah.
I think it really comes down to personal preference sometimes, and how much you connect with a movement. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing that's interesting to me is that I would say like I have I've found that cables have been great for developing my, my mind to muscle connection, but mind to muscle connection isn't necessarily something I'm necessarily it's not something I'm like going after. It's like a byproduct of what I'm doing. So I've
Mhm.
what I want to really focus on is, what helps me load, what is loadable for me, what feels, yeah, like what's something that I can load, what's something that I can really control, and what are some of the pieces of equipment that allow me to get the best positions. There's, like you were saying, like it's going to differ for everybody, but I've just found cables to be money, like for
Yeah.
like most people. And like even if you don't like, even though you may not like be motivated by cables, I've found them to be have carryover benefits to things like your dumbbell training, which can enhance your and augment your
Hmm.
experience of that training, which is important because like really there's not, science can't tell you your motivation for training. You can only use it as guidelines to help you figure out the best way to do it for you. And I think that like one of the things that you have to prioritize over everything is, you know technique, really, like pushing technique as hard as possible. And I've just seen most bodybuilders, people with big arms, they do things like, overhead tricep extensions with, perfect technique the whole time. They're really focused on getting a pause at the bottom and, fully locking out. There's all types of things that go into it over the course of time. So it's important to find something that you can groove into and feel like you're getting skilled at. Like I actually originally was a dumbbells guy, like you were saying. Like I love dumbbells, and I still I'm at that point now where like I'm moving dumbbells much better than I've ever moved them because my mind to muscle connection is solid. But I
So
think that
that
that's
this
been
is
a
what I want to this is what I want to ask you, and I don't mean to interrupt, but I
mm-hmm,
want to ask you this because I'm like the opposite, I think. I'm not saying that my muscle connection is everything or chasing a pump or whatever, but
mm-hmm,
I do think like if I'm doing a movement and there might be a movement I really usually connect with, and I just go in the gym this day and I'm just like, man, I'm not feeling that contraction there. And then I just
mm-hmm,
switch the movement and I go to a different movement and I feel the contraction completely. I feel like having that muscle mind connection and knowing when and where to choose certain exercises, and they might switch is what I mean, right? Like I have one
yeah,
exercise that really works for me. I go in the gym every time it just hits. And then maybe I start going in there and I'm like, damn, like I just don't really feel this as much. Or like for like what you just said, overhead extensions, for instance, for me for triceps, I don't feel as much as doing like a behind the back push down or something like that
yeah,
to hit the long head. And
mm-hmm,
or even maybe like a skull crusher or something like that. I might want to do a skull crusher instead to hit the long head than hit like an overhead press is kind of what I'm saying. So
mm-hmm,
for that, yes, I see the carryover of just being able to load up and putting the muscle under a load in order to elicit the growth. But it's like if I can't really connect and feel what I'm trying to, feel, just like if I have somebody doing a hamstring curl variation and they say, yeah, I'm not really feeling it, and we do a different one, they're like, oh shit, I'm about to cramp. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's a difference there where it's
Yeah.
like that's money that I feel like, you're leaving a little bit on the table. So for you, it just sounds like you're like, as long as I can potentially get better at this movement, then I'm willing to invest some time into it because you might end up, accumulating some of that muscle mind connection later on that leads to you
Yes.
being like, okay, this is one of my go-to movements. And I agree
Yeah.
with
And
that.
well, I was gonna say too, like I think one of the things to remember also is like, we still want to incorporate variation as much as possible. So like I'll stay on a movement at the most maybe 5 to 6 weeks, and then I want to obviously change it up so that I can, recover from the damage or fatigue that I've accumulated over the course of time,
Mhm.
and just changing up the muscle fibers that I'm using. But I've just found that like I'll put in a good amount of work for 6 weeks. I'll change up, the variation that I'm doing, and then I'll come back. I'll come back to what I like that what it's and I think too it's also just like a high motivation movement. Like maybe I just like it, like you were saying. I come back to it and I can PR, and I feel like it's just it's important to find those movements. I feel like that are money for you,
Mhm.
and whether it's cables, dumbbells, easy bar curl, whatever, finding something that you like training too. Because that's the other thing about all of this is it's like, yes, you want big arms, but you should still, I think there has to be some element of enjoyment in the process of training them. Then
Mhm.
again, arms are just typically, enjoyable because when you feel that pump, it's just like otherworldly, it's
And
just like
everybody
getting
is
up.
aesthetic. It's on the front of the body. You can see it when you're
Yeah.
training it. So you look
Yeah.
better in shirts. Everybody wants big
Exactly.
arms. I mean, there's not a single
Yes.
person who lives who says, oh yeah, I don't want my arms to get any bigger. You know what I'm saying? Or I want
Yeah.
smaller arms. Nobody says that. Everybody wants
Yeah,
bigger
I,
arms.
I even
So
know some I even know some women who are like, oh, you started off being like, I don't want to be too bulky. And then, year of training goes by and they're like, yeah, I'm trying to get bigger.
yeah.
I'm trying to get some bigger arms. I'm like,
Either
damn.
that or even just cutting arms up, you notice how your aesthetic changes. So
Yes,
yeah. Now what about
absolutely.
triceps? Let's talk about triceps real quick because I think tricep
Triceps.
training is a lot I won't say more complicated, but there's a lot more to think about, I feel like,
There
than
is.
biceps. Biceps is
Mm-hmm.
purely elbow flexion for the most part. Other
Mm-hmm.
than the one, letting that elbow track forward a little bit and keep, squeezing the elbows together, a couple
Mm-hmm.
cues there. But for the most part, you're trying to keep that elbow as stable as possible, and you're just flexing at the elbow. That's it. That's how you're going to get the
Yep.
most bicep contraction for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Now, triceps. Tell me a couple things with triceps that you do that work for you because I'm interested to hear versus what I do.
Well, the thing about triceps is you do have to manage that volume because if you're pressing, then, you don't want your triceps training to affect your presses because it'll just feel really bad and you don't want that. But at the same time, I found that like when I do triceps training, some things that I'm really focused on for size are I'm definitely trying to blow that long head up as much as possible. So obviously overhead tricep extensions, I've used those before. But the other thing that I think people need to realize about growing their triceps is, there's some pressing involved. There has to be
Mm-hmm.
some pressing involved. Like when it comes to growing my triceps, one of the things that I found to be really, really effective is actually just doing close grip on so many different on like most bench variations. Like just doing that and,
Mm-hmm.
that's something I find it's not something you want to do all the time. Your elbows will get freaking tired after a certain point. You'll get fatigued. But, if you've got
One,
to
well,
set some
at
incline.
least one compound press or something like that. I would feel
Yeah.
like that will work, or somewhere around there. I'd say like one a workout is fine. If you really wanted to
Yeah.
just focus on more extensions or something like that, like isolating stuff, you could a day. But no, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I think at least
No, no,
one a day.
absolutely. Yeah. So, having that pressing is really important. And then, I think one of the big ones is just like having a movement that really like you feel like you're lengthening out your
I'm getting
tricep.
a good stretch.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think feeling the stretch is what's going to really help you. Because there's always this tendency to want to push down. There's lots of tricep push down movements. Those are
Mm-hmm.
great. I actually like have to say, that's one of the most effective exercises like ever. Like you could start doing tricep push downs like for like 2 or 3 weeks if you've never trained before and probably see a horseshoe or
You're gonna
something
see a little
forming there,
bump. You're gonna see a little
Yeah,
bump, little
exactly.
mosquito bite.
Push downs just go crazy. You can do
They
so
do.
many different variations.
Oh yeah,
But,
that's a thing too.
I
Yeah.
think it's so I think that's like, dude, one movement that we did in college that really showed me this was the skull crushers, man. You showed me the skull crushers, and I was hooked on those. I've been hooked on those for the last couple of years, honestly.
Now
Like I
doing them
love,
right. Yeah.
yeah.
Now doing them
And it takes
correctly.
time. It takes time to figure it out, man. It really does.
Yeah.
Like, and
Yeah.
I used to overload them and put too much weight on there, and I wasn't necessarily What I've learned too is like you don't necessarily need to do like 12, 15 reps all the time, but have you just want to be able to progress it safely, do things
Mm-hmm.
with good technique, make sure you're actually one thing I've still, that from the biceps training that carries over for this is like that pause at the bottom, making sure I really am in that lengthened position for at least a second. I'm really holding it there for a second because that's what's really going to force me to, put the load on the muscle. And, because it's easy with skull crushers to use momentum to just boom, 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 boom.
Mm-hmm.
But you really want to focus on holding this position. And I think that is one of the key things to start doing right now if you want to see your triceps grow, because I found that it's just too easy to use momentum on something like a skull crusher, especially when you're using both arms.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing too with skull crushers is, the freedom of the range of motion. It's modular. Like with an easy bar, I found that like I don't get as much of a stretch as something like a dumbbell. Like if I go all the way down with a dumbbell, and I find I can hold it a little bit longer with dumbbells. But again, like that's not necessarily um it's not, I'm not going to say that like one's better than the other. It's really just, how I feel and what I feel is best for
Mm-hmm.
my leverages.
Yeah.
How do you feel
Yeah.
about, some of those things?
Yeah. For me at least, when it comes to like tricep training, I think there's three things that if you can perfect them or at least be aware of them, you can get so much more out of your tricep exercises. Like when I say so much, I mean like night and day. Those three things I would say would be focusing more on joint displacement, like elbow displacement. So
Mm-hmm.
if I'm doing even like a push down, instead of me just trying to separate my hands, a lot of times what I do is I'll focus on having my elbows go out at the top of the movement and just forcing them
Yes.
in as I go down on the way down.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the same thing if I'm doing a press. Maybe I'm doing like a close grip press where I want to force my elbows out when I'm pressing. Again, I'm focused on just pushing my elbows in and then bringing my elbows right back out. That's all I'm doing. I'm not focused on getting the weight up, nothing else. All I'm focusing
Mm-hmm.
on is just elbows in, elbows
that
out. When you
actual that actual movement, yeah.
that actual movement, because again, when it comes to like triceps, yes, like just straight up elbow extension is enough to get them to like click, to get them to engage. But when you
Yeah,
add the joint displacement, like you add pushing that elbow through as well, like every
that's
every
why I
single
love the
exercise.
JM press. Have you done the JM
The
press
J press,
before?
exactly. Yes, I've done
JM
that one
press
as
goes
well. Yes.
crazy.
So because you
Mm-hmm.
get both, you get like a press and an extension in the same movement essentially.
Yes,
So,
I like to
but
do it on the
but
Smith machine.
yeah, but this is what I mean. So like literally just focusing on that. Doesn't matter if it's a bench dip, you focus on getting those elbows through. Doesn't matter if it's a push
Mm-hmm.
down, whatever it is, most 9 times out of 10, you add that little bit in and trying to get the elbow or the arm as straight as possible. So maybe on a push down, instead of just, focus on getting the elbows in, I'm also focused on getting my hands down as low as I can too. So the arm straighten as much as I can. Because it's the same thing with the bicep. The more elbow flexion I have, the more bicep engagement I'm going to get for the most part.
Right.
Again, with the caveat of some of the other exercises like we mentioned earlier. But with the triceps, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to get most tricep engagement the straighter I can get my arm at the end of the movement, at the end of the
Right.
range of motion.
Yeah, and I think that's something I've noticed too. Like some people just don't lock out, and they are big on the partial
And then
reps.
though, but
And
then they'll rush the lockout where you get to the lockout and this is this, right? And it's they're controlling the eccentric, but
yeah,
I'm like, dude, get
yeah,
there, hold, squeeze the shit
yeah.
out of that. Like squeeze it right here because this
Mm-hmm.
is where you get this is where the money's made. Why would I rush this and just come right back out? if this is where all the
Yep.
money's made, I want to go slow getting down here. I'm going to squeeze this for a second as hard as I can, and then slow coming back as well.
Right.
You start milking them reps like that, and then you start learning, like, again, like the different angles you can play with triceps as well. Like what you said, like going behind the head for long head, or staying more to the front of the body for the short head, or adding some of the presses in where you can get a little bit of both as well, and knowing how to go,
Exactly.
and get a full round, like a full well-rounded tricep. And what I started doing recently specifically is, again, doing a lot of stuff where it's elbows wide to elbows in, where I'm like purposely forcing myself out like this. Right. So whether it be doing a
Right.
push down, whether it's doing literally like a press, whether it's doing an extension, that's what really gets that long head to give you that roundness at the bottom of the bottom of the arm as
Yes.
well. But my point there
And
being,
that's
again,
what's going to
with
make you
all
look
this,
good in shirts, man. Let me tell you,
exactly.
you'll
Yeah.
you'll look
So
so much better in shirts.
yeah,
And that,
but my
I think that's one thing to accentuate here, to kind of bring it all back, is like when we think about training arms, like, you know, it really is such a game changer, because like some people, like, if you're wanting that feeling of like, I want, you know, to look like I go to the gym, you know, feeling good about how they look and how you look in shirts and stuff like that, it can just be one of those things that overall keeps you coming back to the gym and feeling good about what you're doing and training. So one thing I will say is, like, it's not wrong to want to train arms. Yet, like, sure, like, some people would say it's like a vanity muscle, but you know what? It does. It looks good. So, train them shits, man. Train them hard, because you're going to see some great progress from them, and from training them harder. And it will have carryover effects to other things too in your life, in your general life. And also, don't forget to neglect forearms, but at the same time, that's why you should just have a balanced split, because when you're, doing things that require a lot of grip strength, that's also going to have an effect on your
yeah.
ability and, arm training and things of the like. So, and also don't be afraid to use things like, um, well, I guess you don't really need to use straps that much really with arm training, but, don't be afraid to use some tools. Don't be afraid to experiment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm in agreement. I definitely agree. I think my last little take home point would just be, again, if you want to grow your arms, if you want to improve them, then you got to treat them like anything else you want to grow or improve. You got to really try to prioritize them, and do it for long enough for you to actually see the progress. Don't do it for just
Yeah.
2 weeks and say, "Oh, I did it for 2 weeks and
Oh,
I haven't
yeah.
seen anything," or whatever. Like, you got to give it 4, 6,
Yeah. Give
8.
it a few months.
Yeah,
Yeah.
give it some
At least
time.
two.
Yeah, give it some time. And yeah, but I think that was good. I think, again, like the past couple of times we've, gone over some of the cues that we've given even more information, and just in terms of how to program and things to think about. And we can dive into more of that stuff at a later date too. But I know next week we're going to be talking about back training, some of the
Heck
things we think
yeah.
about there, and cues there too. So but yeah. Anything else you want to add, Alex, to the arm trainer before we wrap it up right
Yeah.
now?
Well, I would say, guys, keep, we want to hear from you. We want your engagement. Let us know in the comments about, videos and ideas and things you want to hear about from us. Um, if there's anything in particular, drop it in the comments below. Eat your damn protein so that you can get huge
Hold
arms.
up, hold
And
up. We need a thumbnail real quick, Alex, for the next video. Put them up right here. We need a thumbnail right there.
yeah, baby.
And I got your dog's what he got in his mouth. I thought it was his ear for a second.
She's got a little torn
Oh,
up donut. There
excuse
used
me,
to be
excuse me.
some
Oh,
fluff in
dang.
there, but
Yeah, she got a
it's
little
gone.
hungry.
Yeah, she did.
All
All right,
right,
man.
man. Yeah, I'll see you next week, bro.
All
We'll
right.
talk about back. But yeah, man. Keep
Sounds
being great,
good.
y'all. Eat your
Yeah,
protein.
and eat your protein for real.
Do all that. All right. We'll check
All
in next
right.
week. See you, man.
Sounds
All right, be
good.
safe.
Peace.